For antiwar.com and Chaos Radio 95.9 in Austin, Texas, I'm Scott Horton. This is Anti-War Radio. All right, we're going to start this show off with our first interview. It's the other Scott Horton, heroic international human rights, anti-torture lawyer and professor at Columbia University. He's a legal affairs correspondent at Harpers magazine, where he keeps the great blog that I'm looking at right now, No Comment. Welcome back to the show, Scott. How are you doing?
Hey, great to be with you, Scott.
Well, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate you making the time for us today. I know it's, I guess, blizzard conditions again there in the Northeast, huh?
That's right. You know, sort of warm, big snowflakes falling, but, you know, making things a little bit difficult to get around.
Yeah. I saw a picture of a guy made a really cool colored kind of Chinese-looking dragon out of a snowbank on a sidewalk. That was pretty cool. Somewhere up there. All right, anyway, first of all, let's talk about the Guantanamo suicides. Your article it's the March issue of Harpers, right?
That's right.
And
on the stands now.
And, oh, good. And, of course, it's at the website at harpers.org as well. And you've had some interviews on your blog lately, No Comment there, where you've, I guess, basically been talking to medical professionals about the autopsy and other issues like that. Why don't you go ahead and fill us in on the developments in this story?
Well, that's right. You know, the Pentagon responded to my story in part by saying it was just standard procedure to remove the throats from the victims of death by asphyxiation and to preserve them. And there was nothing unusual about the fact that the bodies were then turned over to their families with these throats removed, and they couldn't be examined for a secondary autopsy. And then they went on to say the families never asked for the throats to be turned over. So I went and I tracked down the attorneys for the families. In fact, I published the letter making the demand, and I also examined this long series of emails that went back and forth between the chief military pathologist who worked on the case and the Swiss pathologists who were trying to do the secondary autopsy, in the course of which the U.S. military guy said, gee, I'd love to cooperate with you, but I'm being ordered not to. So that explains what was going on there. We also had a long interview with Dr. Michael Badens, the guy who does the HBO series Autopsy, and is also the chief forensic pathologist or expert for Fox News. And he talked about what he saw, and he said basically he thought the government's autopsy reports raised very, very serious questions, that there were irregularities at every turn, and you know, he suggested very strongly he thought there was a great need for further examination of the bodies here and the materials to see if the government's claim that these people committed suicide by hanging could really stand up.
All right. Now, so first of all here we have them busted in a lie, busted by documents, saying that the families never asked for these body parts, and the families can prove that, yes, in fact, they did. That's one thing, right?
That's right, and we also have the people on it's not a question of the letter being lost somehow, because we got communications later with the military pathologist acknowledging he got it.
And then you say it was the follow-up attempted pathologist, the Swiss guy, who said that he's been ordered not to talk. Is that right?
Nope, the other way around.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The families asked the Swiss pathologist to do a second autopsy, and the Swiss pathologist and his team then communicated with the American doctor who did the first autopsy, saying they had questions. They were concerned about the fact that these body parts had been removed. They needed to examine them. And the American responded saying, gee, I'd love to cooperate with you, but I'm being ordered not to. So very, very clear that somebody in the military was giving directions for no cooperation with the second autopsy, which is really, really suspicious.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other thing entirely than the way I had framed it there. That was the conversation between pathologists. Now, here's the thing, though. I don't know anything about pathology or the politics of such things. Is that some kind of unheard of, unprecedented thing for an autopsy doctor in the military to say to some foreign civilian, sorry, I can't help you?
Very unusual. In fact, I've spoken also with several military pathologists who've told me that there's just no question about it that cooperation with if the family asks for a second autopsy and qualified pathologists undertake it, which is what was going on here, it's just reflexive. They automatically cooperate. So it's really unheard of for them to refuse cooperation and to refuse to turn over all the body parts. It smacks of a very serious cover-up.
Mm-hmm. Now, part of this was a particular bone that was broken in the neck, and you've reported, and I think you quote the Fox News expert on your blog there, saying that, yes, this is the kind of thing, this bone is much more likely to be broken in a manual strangulation than in a hanging, but then how likely was it, or did he say how likely it was that this bone could actually just be broken accidentally during the autopsy, which is, I think, the government's story about why this bone is broken in this at least one victim?
Well, that's right. It's called the hyoid bone, and Dr. Badens says, when you see a broken hyoid bone, that's usually very strong evidence that somebody's been strangled, not consistent with a suicide attempt or a suicide by hanging. But the government claims that the hyoid bone was broken accidentally when they were removing the neck material. And Dr. Badens says, this is something that can be established very clearly one way or the other by examination of the material right around the bone. If it shows hemorrhaging or bleeding or contusions, that would indicate that the bone was broken while the guy was still alive, which would mean he was strangled to death. And if you don't see that sort of presence of blood and bruises, that would indicate that the breaking occurred, as the government alleges, after he died. So that's something that could be checked up on pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, but here we're in a situation where the checking is not being allowed. Did he indicate whether he thought that was kind of a surprising version of the story, that, come on, how would the hyoid bone be broken during an autopsy? Or is that the kind of thing that could happen and probably does happen all the time?
Of course, it's possible that you could break it while removing, but, that would indicate real incompetence on the part of the pathologist who is removing this material. So it's certainly not something that usually occurs. So I think his view was that this was yet another very disturbing fact.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, Seton Hall University, which first put together the report about this asymmetric attack by Al-Qaeda against us here, they now have a follow-up because, of course, the Pentagon, in disputing your story, has attempted to dispute them as well. And in their follow-up, they kind of made a mockery out of the Pentagon's defense here. Scott, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that's right. They issued a subsequent report that was called DOD Contradicts DOD, in which they went over the major claims that the DOD made and its attempts to rebut my story, and it showed how pretty much all these claims they make contradict things that they said earlier on. Good example, they say that my claim that the three prisoners were found with cloth down their windpipe, down their throats, is absolutely untrue. They say only one of them had cloth down his throat. That's the DOD statement in response to my article. It's absolutely untrue. You can go back and you look at the report that was prepared by the Naval Criminal Investigation Service, and it clearly shows that all three of them were found with cloth in the windpipe. In fact, the government also went on, the Pentagon did, to say I was insinuating some sort of insidious conduct by government pathologists, suggesting that they must have removed the cloth in some way and destroyed evidence. But in fact, the removal of the cloth is documented in the report. You've got the reports of medical professionals who say the cloth was in the throat and they removed it before attempting resuscitation in one case, and in order to get to access to the windpipe and mouth in another case. So again, the Department of Defense responds without really reading the report.
Yeah, well, and let's focus on that. There are more contradictions here I'd like to talk about, but on the rags thing, I don't know. It's kind of just sloppiness on the part of the cover-up here, where they're not even checking their own statement. I mean, they're changing the number. They're saying, well, and maybe I'm confused. Are they saying only one of them had a rag in his mouth at all, or only now they all three did, but only one of them had somehow inhaled the rag down his throat, or?